Hello everyone, Memory here. So this is the second new skill in the 3.15 league that I experimented with, the Forbidden Rite. This is one of the skills I mentioned in my patch note videos that caught my interest. My prediction was it is going to be a very strong skill to use since it has an obvious downside. I've been looking around to see what other people have to offer with Forbidden Rite. And most people are using Totems because it ignores the downside of self-inflicting chaos damage while boosting its DPS, since Totems can have really high HP, and HP means damage for this skill. So that's what I went for as well. And after playing around with it for a while, I came up with a build that successfully cleared a few tier 16 maps along with some Shaper Guardians, with around 1 million Cyrus DPS. However, my conclusion on this build is not exactly that great, or at least not as good as I thought it would be. Most likely there will be better ideas coming from the community in the future, but as for now, I'm gonna give my version of the build a 6 out of 10. It passes in terms of it has enough things going on which allows it to clear tier 16 maps, and probably Cyrus as well. The best thing about this build is it can do maps with many mods that most players wouldn't like to see. Most notably the curses, because this build is 100% unaffected by curses. This build completely ignores all those mods, which actually saved me a noticeable amount of currency on rolling maps when I was doing the tests. It performs better in boss fights compared to mapping, but the mapping speed is not exactly slow compared to some of the other bossing focused builds. And my current version of the build is actually not too expensive as well, since it doesn't use any cluster jewels or any expensive jewels at all. The most expensive thing is probably the 6-link body armor, which is a good news for people who want to use it as a league starter. However, there are two major issues that I have with this build. One is that it is fairly squishy, while already using Mind Over Matter. I've experienced many random one-shots when I was running maps. I understand that there are rooms to make it more tanky, but from my experience, it will either need a lot of currency to make any meaningful upgrades towards survivability, or you need to change a significant amount of the build to do so, which in that case probably should just remake the build entirely. The second problem is that there is a big delay between pressing the button and the damage hits. This delay comes from the time between placing the totem and the totem attacks, and also the time between the totem shoots and the projectile hits. This causes map clear to be not as smooth as I like, and if the mobs has high movement speed, oftentimes the projectile are going to miss. Other than those two issues, this build is actually quite decent. I did try to think of ways to solve those problems, and what I came up with is curses. As you can see on the screen, this build uses 3 curses. Despair is a must for this build because it increases our DPS. We then have Enfeeble that reduces the damage from the enemy, which increases our survivability. And Temporal Chain slows the enemy down so they are easier for the projectiles to hit, while also making us easier to kite around the enemies, which again increases our survivability. Wither also achieves similar goal as Temporal Chain, but since it is a channeling skill, I don't usually rely on it. I only use Wither while I think I'm safe to boost my DPS. I went with Corrupted Blood so I can take the Pain Attunement damage boost while not losing the ability to take hit damage. We do have a decent amount of life regen, so we are actually not that weak against damage over time even though we are using Corrupted Blood. Anyways, let's quickly have a look at what this build actually looks like, starting from the Ascendancy passives. This line over here says Totem, so get them. As for the last 4 points, I went with the Arcane Surge to begin with, but after some testing, it's actually not that great. And then I remembered Arcane Surge was nerfed in this patch, so I swapped over to Mana passives. And this worked extremely well with this build because it allows me to have 5 auras and still able to use Mind Over Matter at its full capacity. It also gives me quite a bit of damage and energy shield at the same time. And on top of that, it also solves our mana issues. Before I take this route, I occasionally won't have enough mana to even cast Dash. And now I have enough mana to use Cast on Damage Taken as if Trigger Skill cost mana nerf doesn't exist. which is great. Next we have the gears. For main hand I use Cerberus Limb because it has decent spell damage and cast speed while providing a little bit of extra defense, and also it's super cheap. For offhand I use a Prism Guardian to reserve 2 of my auras with life so I can have enough mana for Mind Over Matter. For body armor I use Soul Mantle like everyone else for the 7 link it provides, and we use 2 Kikazaru Ring with a silent passive for curse immunity because we need to mitigate the downside of Soul Mantle, which is self-curse when Totem dies. We use the Torch Oak boots because it gives us decent move speed and Totem life. Totem life equals to damage as mentioned before because of how Forbidden Rite works. For the gloves I use Vixen's gloves so I can cast all 3 curses at the same time, and the rest of the gears are just for life and resistances. As for jewels, Rain of Splinters is a must for the extra projectiles. I have a careful planning here to give me enough dex because I use dash as my movement skill. I have an intuitive leap here to save me a few passive points, and finally a self-flagellation to provide damage boost for each curse on me, since we are self-cursing all the time with the Soul Mantle effect. Moving on to the skill links, the Forbidden Rite is linked with multiple totems, Void Manipulation, faster casting here because it increases the speed of the totem using Forbidden Rite, greater volley and then increased critical damage. Don't use concentrated effect here because all projectiles can damage the same target, so more AoE you have, the more projectile is going to hit the same target for our single target damage. For our gloves, we have Temporal Chain and Enfeeble linked with Empower and Arcane Surge. Since triggered skill now costs mana, that means Arcane Surge works on them as well, so this is how we get Arcane Surge. On our helmets, we have Steel Skin and Increased Duration linked with cost on damage taken. Since our Steel Skin only costs 26 mana and we have around 400 mana regen in combat, so even if triggered skill now costs mana, it is still reliable enough to use cost when damage taken to trigger it. The last slot here we have Despair that is not linked with cost on damage taken, so we can use it to trigger curses on the gloves. Then we have Dash, Second Wind and Wither over here. Stacking Wither gives us a huge single target damage boost, something like almost triples our DPS on max stack, which is 15. But that is not realistic because this skill is a channeling skill, and it takes 1.8 seconds to channel the skill just to reach 10 stacks. Usually you won't have much chances to stand still for more than 2 seconds, so I only put 10 stacks of Wither instead of 15 in the POB. For our shield, Petrified Blood and Discipline linked with Enlighten, which roughly reserves 50% of our life. And lastly, on your boots, we have Vitality, Clarity, and Zealotry linked with Enlighten again, which leaves us with enough mana for Mind Over Matter after the mana reservation. Next up, the passive trees. We have some totem stuff here, and more totem stuff here and here. And because we also use curses, we have some curse stuff here and 1 point over here. And since we use Mind Over Matter, we need some mana passives. We have these one here, the Intuitive Leap here, and also here. I'm not high level enough, but after I level up, I am going to get the Arcane Wheel over here for mana as well. As for damage, we take the Chaos damage over here. And then we take 3 crit circles here, here, and here. Don't forget Pain Attunement here because it is a huge damage boost. And finally, we take the 2 very good casting speed circles here and here. If you do get to level 91, which is what my POB says, you also have these 3 casting speed passives over here to give you even more DPS. And finally, the flasks. Quicksilver Flask, Dying Sun, and Silver Flask are a must. The other 2 slots you can get anything you feel like. I have Diamond Flask for more damage and Eternal Mana Flask to make sure my mana can keep up with Mind over Matter in certain situations. You can also use Granite Flask and Basalt Flask. Together they give you around 15% more physical damage reduction on this build. And that's it for the build. The playstyle of this build is putting a totem down, walk towards the totem, put another totem down, rinse and repeat, because you want the mobs to aggro to your totems first. Since you are considered squishy, you dash back as soon as you see anything moving, and then cast your curse and wither on the mobs until they die. This is a viable build to end game since I am able to clear Shaper Guardians. It doesn't have anything that it is particularly bad at. So far I had no problems doing any league mechanics. This character is made and tested in standard, but from what I can see it can clear the Expedition League mechanic content just fine. So if you are looking for a build that uses the new skill gems, this is definitely one of the builds for you. If I am playing this build in the Expedition League, this current gears and gem set is probably how much I would spend on this character. At the time of making this video, the entire character costs around 10x in the Expedition League. I did not use any cluster jewels as mentioned earlier because yes, it does increase my total damage by around 36%, but the amount of passive points needed to open those clusters doesn't really justify what I'm getting, because after taking all the required passives to make this build functional, there are still enough passives left on the tree that gives me similar amount of damage as the cluster passives. At least that's what the POE tells me anyways. So there are no reasons for me to open a cluster jewels here. Most of the cost actually comes from the 6-link Soul Mantle, sitting at around 7x at the moment. I think this build will drop to roughly 6 to 7 exalts for everything after a month or something, since it's not exactly an overpowered build as far as I can tell. So if you want to play this build in a budget, make this your second or even third character. Personally though, I still prefer my first build of the league using the Focus Ballista Barrage Totem. It is still a totem build, but it has way faster map clear and bossing ability. It also dies way less because everything gets pushed out of the screen real fast, so they rarely have any chance to make an attack on you, including most bosses. And yes, the video will be in the description, along with the POV for this video. Anyways, that's it for today. Subscribe for extra mirror drop chance. Hopefully you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.